Talk today is called Tabletop Games as Learning Platforms. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, great. Okay, wonderful. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you all for being here as well. So I'm going to just adjust this. So I'm going to do something a little bit tricky today. You're not supposed to do this you're not supposed to introduce complications into Zoom presentations, but what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to be talking about tabletop games, and especially a number of ancient tabletop games, but I'm going to follow that up to the present day. And because I'm talking about what I'm going to call geometries of play, and how these games work geometrically as forms of participation and interaction between players and students. Here, I thought it'd be interesting to actually, instead of trying to share a slideshow, which would be the easy thing, I'm going to try to actually work with live games. And instead of sharing a slideshow, I'm going to share a tabletop camera that I'll be able to switch back and forth. So I'm gonna cross my fingers that this works smoothly. There'll probably be a couple of bumps because I've never tried this before. Two different live cameras at once, but I think it will be exciting. So what I'm going to talk about here are tabletop games, first of all, as an ancient form of play, right? There's something I think strangely about games that we think of as being somehow more modern. And it's just, we might not intellectually think that, but I think that's our common sort of prejudice or thought. And actually, tabletop games are ancient. They are the oldest forms of play that we know about. We have instances and know about games, specific games that are 5,000 years old. And that's as old as pretty much any literature or any other cultural form that we have evidence of. Of course, they're no doubt much older than that. It's just that those are the oldest surviving copies of games that we've been able to access. Okay, so I'm going to specifically talk about something that I call geometries of play. And geometries of play are forms that games take, specifically tabletop games, forms that they take that enable a kind of closed world that players can enter into. And I think they're particularly interesting in an educational or classroom environment. And I teach board games frequently. I teach video games and board games and other forms of play. But specifically, I want to focus on board games here. We can talk about video games if anyone wants to in the Q&A as well. But board games, I think, are particularly interesting for this reason. Okay. So what they do, what any kind of game does, is allow the players to enter into a separate world, right? What sociologist of play Johann Huizinga calls an act apart, or a magic circle that allows new forms of behavior, new relations, new rules, and has its own set of consequences internal to the logic of play, not affecting or minimally affecting the outside world, real life. Which is to say that games are part of real life, but once you enter into a game, you're entering into a kind of magic circle where the normal rules are suspended. And other rules, equally as important, other rules take precedence, right? And the rules of the game, which players have to kind of enter into this contract to be part of, highly constrain what's possible in this new world, in this separate world. But they also enable, allow players a new form of agency. Right? Games are really about agency. This is how they differ from other cultural forms, is that players enter into a world in which they have new powers to act. And tabletop games in particular are about players expressing that agency within this separate world. Okay, so the tabletop or game board acts as a boundary within this world. Right, and I just want to say here the concept of the magic circle, which is really useful here, is mentioned by Huizinga, and this is in the early 20th century, but really popularized and expanded by game scholar Eric Zimmerman in the early 2000s. So fairly recently, he took this idea from Huizinga of the magic circle and an act apart and expanded that. And it's been very influential in game studies, this idea of the magic circle. Okay, so in the cases of the ancient games, and again, we'll get to more modern games as I go along here, but in terms of the ancient games, this space apart or act apart is not necessarily unreal. It's not necessarily a fantasy world. It's more like a kind of folding in of layers, extra layers of reality that are usually beyond experience. We could think of this as spiritual or the afterlife or larger fate that was considered, by the cultures who produced these games very much part of regular life, but outside of maybe our direct experience. And the games would allow players to step into and in some ways formalize those larger or greater aspects of reality and bring them into this, the smaller world of the game. Okay, so again, one of the things that I find super exciting about games in particular is that the rules create a set of constraints on players, but also open up and are all about creating an understanding of agency. That's why games are so exciting in the classroom, is because students aren't just receiving something, as even a cultural form like cinema or television is still has to be passively taken in. Most narrative forms are. But games are about producing narratives. They're about producing something as agents, and that's really exciting for students when they can step into the world of the game. And that world of the game brings them into the cultural context in which the game was produced, but it also creates something separate from the current moment or classroom itself and the sort of culture in which the game was made. There's something in between those two things that emerges through play. Okay, so I'm going to continue here by talking about geometries of play, and what I mean by this term is how different models, a game produces a model of relationality, right? A relationality between players and relationship between the system and the act of narrativization, or how a story between players emerges. Different games set up different models for how that works. Okay. And then after I talk about these specific games, if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways beyond just this that I think games can be utilized in the classroom. And I'd be happy to talk about some contemporary games that deal with certain subjects that have also been interesting for me to teach. We'll see where we get there, and we'll see where anyone's interest lies in terms of Q&A. Okay, so the first geometry of play I want to consider, this is a very, very ancient one, and that's the nonlinear grid, right? And so a grid is a predefined plane of action, of either movement or placement, and we can think here. We're very familiar with this layout, this geometry from games like checkers and chess, and my primary example today, Go. And particularly and these are two of the most popular games even today are Go and chess, right? And in both of these games, the game itself, or the grid within the game, defines an abstract battlefield, right? The two players enter into a magic circle of a battlefield via the board, with defined boundaries and defined moves that are possible. You can't just do anything. You can only do very precise things within that grid. And actually, this is what makes game playing computers possible. And a large part of 20th century computer development and computational development and artificial intelligence was actually about trying to figure out how you could program a computer to play against human players. First in checkers, and when they solved that problem early on, chess, and that took decades to solve. It wasn't until 1997 that a supercomputer by IBM finally was able to beat the best human players at chess. So it's a very difficult problem. And then it wasn't until just 2015 that computers were able to finally be able to beat the best players at Go. And that's because these games have such a huge possibility space, right? And this is what's interesting. A grid of predefined possibilities, very limited, very simple what you can do. These constraints are extreme, and yet the possibilities are so extreme that the most powerful computers on the planet only recently were able to actually figure out how to play these games well enough to beat human champions. But it's possible because we are dealing with a defined system. Okay, so here I'm going to actually share now. I'm going to share my okay. Can you all see that, the game board? Yes, great. All right. So we'll do my best here to be able to swap back and forth between these two cameras. So this is Go, which probably most of you know, but maybe I don't know how well. And I'm not going to go through all the rules of these games. I just but the overview of Go is that it's a game about territorial control. And so it's just two players, and they're trying to encircle territory, right? And so as you place these pieces, which are called stones, you're trying to basically encircle your opponent and or encircle space on the board. You're trying to kind of control as much space as possible by encircling it. And the two players are both trying to block each other as well as encircle each other, because you can also capture each other's pieces if you encircle them. Okay. So the relationship between the players in this kind of system, in this linear grid, I mean non-linear grid, I'm sorry, it's non-linear because you can place pieces anywhere you want, right? It's about controlling the board, but you can move anywhere. There's no limitation to where on the board you can move. You just have to stay within the grid. In chess and checkers, of course, you have to stay on the spaces, but in Go, you play on the intersections of the spaces. But in both cases, it's a grid. Okay. So what's exciting here, and part of the pleasure of these kinds of games, is the planar reduction of life's dynamics into a determinate system, right? And part of the pleasure here is the planar trap, what I call the planar trap, right? Which is to say that the game reduces the world to a single plane, right? It's a single plane, a single grid of intersections is it. That's the entire world of the inside the magic circle. But what's great about that is with that constraint, all the so this is supposed to be a game about a battle or a campaign, and but you don't have all the complexities of that. It's not trying to simulate the complexities of war. You don't have things like logistics or maneuvers or field of view or terrain, environment, all of the things that would matter in a kind of strategic real life battle. It's as simple as, no, all you do is place pieces on intersections, and that's the sum of your ability in this game, right? So in what way is that exciting? How does that reduction lead to something greater than regular life? Right. That's what's exciting to me. And one of the pleasures of this as players is that is the trap. The nonlinear grid allows for you to set your opponent up to compel them to make moves that are suboptimal, right? That are not the kind of move that they want to make strategically, but you force them to do it. In this case, you can force a player to continually try to prevent you from cutting them off and thus encircling them, right? And so, as we know this from chess too, you can compel people in check moves to have to move their king or have to move some other piece in order to avoid capture. And by doing so, you're always playing your opponent, right? You're not just yourself coming up with a strategy and enacting it in terms of the pieces on the board, in terms of controlling territory. You're also compelling your opponent to do things that ultimately will not benefit them, i.e. you're springing a trap. And I think that's one of the exciting things about this geometry, right? The players are attempting to trap each other, and they're attempting to enclose not just each other's pieces, but each other's agency, right? It's a game of agency versus agency, right? And so the rules of the game make that possible. You can't violate the rules, right? And because of that, you can force each other to do something. Okay, so the subsidiary pleasure here and move is that of evasion, which is to say your opponent tries to get you to do something, but you creatively, as a player, come up with something else to do instead, right? And you find a way. They think they've compelled you to do something, and you find a way out of that trap with a creative lateral thinking. And both chess and Go are really great for this. And in fact, this is why Go in ancient China, as well as Japan and Korea, is studied. It's studied. It's considered to be very serious, right? It's not just a diversion. It's studied by people who aspire to leadership and or military. And it's like, again, it doesn't simulate war so much as it simulates a kind of thinking that was considered to be vital to someone who would, for instance, command an army, right? So it's more about leadership and forms of thinking that lock into that geometry than it is about simulating real life conflict, right? But the idea was that as a kind of martial art, mastering this game would help you master those other dynamics in life, right? So the abstraction into simple rules plays a role, not because it's of its fidelity to real life, but rather because of its abstraction, its applicability to a wide range of interactions within life. Okay. So the formal relationship between players here is that they must abide by the same rules and possibilities, and yet generate creative moves within those constraints and within that system. That's what's exciting about this geometry. Okay, so I'm going to move to another geometry here. Equally ancient, but more popular in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia rather than in ancient Asia. Okay, so if the first was the nonlinear grid, the second is the linear grid. Oops, knocked over some pieces. This is a game called Senate. And this is, again, about 5,000 years old. It's the earliest examples we have of it are from about 3000 BC in Egypt. And this was a very popular game and is still played to the present day without the popularity of Go, but certainly is still known and played today, has continuity. the way this works is it's a grid, but it's a linear grid, which is to say that the game's rules embed paths into the game, so that you cannot move, for instance, anywhere you'd like along this grid, or place pieces anywhere on the grid like in Go. Instead, you have to move pieces in a particular geometry. So, and it goes like this along here, and then goes to here, and then down here, and then you move to here, this row, and along this row. And this is the end. So this would be the first space. This would be the final space. A game like this it creates a linear grid for players to interact within is, again, a plane of shared constraint, right? You still have the grid, but the additional constraint is that there's only one path through the grid allowed. And players here, when they enter into this game, they enter not a battlefield, but a journey, right? Players enter into a kind of narrative structure. There's an implied journey here. Okay. Right? It plays out kind of like a battlefield in the sense that the two players in this game harass each other and try to stop each other from making progress, or try to utilize your opponent to make extra progress, right? So it's still very much a contentious sort of battlefield, but it's a battlefield with directionality, right? So player agency is again limited, but there is something new in this game. And excuse me one moment, because I have to grab the pieces. Let's see if I can. Where did it? Okay, just one moment. Okay, so this game uses something. This game introduces luck, and in fact, all linear grid games have some luck involved. And if you can see here, these are throwing sticks. So these were very popular in ancient Egypt. And what you do with these is you take them in your hand and you toss them and see how they land. And this probably has its roots in divination and other practices, but here it's used to determine what the possibilities are for a player on their turn, right? We tend to use dice today, or cards, but this is actually more interesting because it's not an equal distribution of numbers like a die has. The probabilities are different for different outcomes, and that makes it for players to be able to manage their luck better, which is to say that you throw this and you see how many flat sides come up. That determines how many spaces you can move on the board. And what that allows you to do is you manage your luck, and you go, oh, okay, I know that the probability of a 2 is this much greater than a 3 or a 1, and I know the probability of a 4 is this. And so what I'm going to do is arrange my pieces on the board to make use of what I think are the most likely outcomes. So that's to say that there's uncertainty, right? And the idea here is that fate and environment and external factors intrude upon the narrative of the game. You don't know. There's uncertainty in this game. It's not just the uncertainty of what your opponent will do, like in Go, but the uncertainty of what the world around you or fate will have in store for you. However, that's manageable because it comes in certain, meta packages, right? Like we know that uncertainty will come within certain probabilities, and because of that, you can play in such a way that you can manage fate. And this is very much tied to the cultural significance of the game, which was thought of as a kind of analog for life. This is almost like the path through life was what this board represented to ancient Egyptians. Right, and so you would ultimately get to the afterlife is your goal, and to sort of get there smoothly and make a smooth journey of it, and not get trapped and caught in the various traps of life, which are represented by certain spaces here that trap you and push you backwards. That you have to roll certain things or throw certain things to get out of, etc. And then there are these positive spaces as well that can help you along. This is a symbol for basically for good luck, good fortune in ancient Egyptian. Okay, so that's how that works. And now I'm going to switch to another geometry. We're low on time, so I'm going to skip through this very fast. But I hope that makes sense. There's a narrative implied in that nonlinearity. It becomes a path and not instead of a sort of control. This is a game called Men. M-E-H-E-N is how you would transliterate it in English. This is also an ancient Egyptian game. It's as old as Sinet, but it was lost. We have archaeological examples of it, but the rules have been lost and no one has known how to play it. And the game was totally unavailable until I decided to make it my mission several years ago to bring this game back to popular consciousness in some way. And I created this version for my own game company. That last game was also one that I created. But anyway, so my sort of hobby company, Pandora Games, made these and did a Kickstarter for these. These are long gone, but now we have a cloth version of it. I'm trying to make this game available to people to actually play again. It was very popular for about 1,000 years, from 3000 BC to 2000 BC. Anyway, it's a snake and it's coiled up. The snake is named Men. It's a god. This might be actually no one knows the religion and the god Men arises in ancient Egypt around the same time that the game does. And so it's been hypothesized by scholars that this might actually be an example of a board game giving rise to a religion, which is to say that it's not, no one's sure which came first, but they're about contemporaneous. People would play this game and they would worship this god. And eventually the religion became so big that the game was outlawed. It was thought of as sacrilegious to chop up the snake, chop up the god into separate pieces. Anyway, that's a whole nother story. So eventually the game seemingly becomes taboo after it gave rise to the religion that killed it. Anyway, what this is a spiral. And so it's a nonlinear grid that's been turned into a spiral. As you move into the center, as you move forward, you're moving centripetally into the center. That's the nature of the spiral, right? And which is to say that you're not just moving through a space, you're moving, there's something that's constricting as you move forward. And this adds in a whole new dimension to the game. And that's why it's really sad that this game was forgotten and why I wanted to bring it back, because it's a totally different form of linearity and a different form of narrative structure. Men, the snake god, protects Ra, the god of the sun, at night. When Ra goes beneath into the underworld, the snake coils around Ra and protects Ra from the sort of his enemies. So it's very important, very dangerous god, very important protector god, protector god. So anyway, this is how it works. You move inward and then pieces turn into lions that move outward and devour the pieces. So you're constantly trying to navigate two counter spirals in the game, one of which is you moving your pieces inward, second of which is all players can move these lions going outward along the spiral. So it's more dangerous the closer to the center you get, and that's why the spiral is so interesting. You're greater and greater constraints on your movement as you move forward because you're also moving inward. It gets more and more dangerous. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there because we are at the end of our time. I don't know if we have a few more minutes. If we do, I'd happily take some questions or any other thoughts. But that's up to you.
Yes, please if anybody has any questions, insights to share and or ask Dr. Horton, that would be wonderful. We can just switch around a few minutes real quick.
Okay.
And thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. Just love them. And our teachers do have the Senate game that was sent to them as a resource before the Institute. So I'm sure they do appreciate the guidance on that.
Yeah. So I'll say before, before any questions, or if there are, as we wait for questions, that to kind of link these together, each one of these models is what I'm really saying is each one of these models is a different form of interaction, right? It's a different kind of magic circle that players or students, in this case, enter into. But when we look at the game, we can think about interaction more generally. We can think of everything from political speech to on social media. We can ask, what kind of models do we use to interact with? What kind of systems, in other words, do we enter into in our lives that that produce certain constraints and certain possibilities for agency, and how do we use that agency with regard to other people, right? And games formalize that in a way that makes it digestible and fun, right? Whereas a lot of stuff in life is not fun in terms of these interactions, especially contentious interactions. But games allow us, because it's a magic circle, they allow us to examine and play out the dynamics, various models of interaction and possibility spaces, right? Each one of these models has a different set of possibility spaces for what can be done and what can't be done. This game, Men, actually is, in the ancient version of this game, what allowed up to 6 players. So it was a very communal game, as opposed to what almost every other ancient game, which was designed for 2 players. So it's very actually interesting in that regard that it would enable that many players. It wasn't thought of as like a contest between 2 players as much as it was a kind of social system, with a lot of players trying to reach enlightenment, is the word I used. It's a little anachronistic, but it's the best word I can think of to suggest what the goal of the game is, which is to reach men in a kind of pure state, men the god, in order to sort of convene with men, or become yourself a kind of protector and connected to Ra through men, through the god of protection. But men, as a protector of Ra, can devour you, right? So it's the idea here is that there's not just are you playing against other players to kind of beat them, as in Senate, but the environment itself, the center of the board that you're drawn toward inexorably, right? You can't move forward without moving inward. That's the nature of the spiral. Men can devour you. Men, the god, will eat you if you make a misstep, right? If you are impure. And so there's a constant danger of that. In my version of the game, if you throw certain types of throws on the sticks, if you throw all flats or all rounds like that, what happens is men gets to move. So there's agency that's imparted outside of the players as well, and everyone gets pulled inward in the spiral when that kind of throw happens. And if you get pulled into the snake, if you move into the snake head, you have achieved that enlightenment. Your pawn turns into a lion. But if the snake pulls you in, you are devoured instead, right? And that danger only happens as you get closer and closer to the center, right? So players, in some ways, are working against a common environment or a common system, but they're also still competing with each other, right, to move along that path and block each other, or use each other to use other players to propel oneself forward, or use other players to block against the lions, right, or use the lions to devour your opponents. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know. Are there any questions?